I remind you that we have today around the table Knud Erik from Denmark, Jean from France, and Mike from US. And to start, I would like to clear some issues regarding the undigestible fraction and the anti-nutritional factors. But before, I remind you, do not hesitate to ask your questions on the web just now and all along the discussions. So the first question could be, let's understand what do we mean about the undigestible fraction of the feed. What is the undigestible fraction? What are the anti-nutritional factors? What are the interconnection between these different parameters? Dear Knud Erik, could you comment on that?
Well, if one of the, or actually the most important undigestible fraction you find at the end of the small intestine and also in feces, that derives from the fiber fraction. The fiber fraction that represent a number of polysaccharides that cannot be digested by the intestinal enzymes secreted or present in the small intestine of mammals. On the left hand of the slide, you'll see some of the models of a fiber components, and you can see it consists, for instance, of cellulose, hemicelluloses, and also pectin substances. This, depending on the composition, they can be soluble or insoluble to a very extent. I'll try to explain a little bit of what that means. For instance, if we have the insoluble fiber fractions, it's typically so that they can stay intact while passing the upper part of the gastrointestinal tract, thereby also protecting the nutrients that's present within the cell walls. That means that they can encapsulate potential nutrients that potentially can be digested by the intestinal enzymes. That is what I am trying to illustrate by the two round circles in the top of the slides. Another property which is very important for the fibers, that is that when exposed to water, they will hydrate, they will swell. That means that they will increase the water binding capacity. But in addition, in connection with the swelling process and the hydration, there will be some of the polysaccharides that leaks out into the liquid solution, thereby giving viscosity to the gastrointestinal content. So this is some of the most important factors related there.
And where it is located in the grain?
Well, if we are looking on a cereal grains, you'll see that you have a high concentration of fibers in the outer part of the grain, as for instance the pericarp intestinal layer and also the aileron cells, whereas it's lower in when it comes to the endosperm. But what particular is of interest, that is that if you're looking into the aileron layer, the fibers that's present there, they are very insoluble, and the aileron cells by themselves contain high levels of protein, fat, and also phosphorus present as phytic acids. And that I have tried to illustrate in the charts here on the slides, where you can see that there is much higher concentration of these nutrients in the aileron cells as compared to the pericarp intestinal layer and also the endosperm part of it.
Thanks, Knud Erik. Mike, Knud Erik mentioned about the phosphorus, the importance of the phosphorus, how it is anti-nutritional or less digested, I would say.
Sure. If you look at the phytic acid molecule, you can see that there is a propensity to have 12 anionic protons around the molecule in the cartoon that's drawn there, which is a very powerful chelation molecule. A number of interactions are listed. The ternary is one, the binary is one, Hofsmeyer is one. We know a little bit less about that. I'll mention the ternary response because that's a salt linkage bridge with the cation. Could be any cation, zinc, copper, iron, but probably more calcium based on the level of calcium in the diet. And the key there is any amino acid could be involved. And on the references that are listed on the slide, Peter Selle is referenced in the review in 2000, and he begs for more research in the area for that interaction, specifically for protein digestibility. And then the one we know most about is the binary. But the binary, the uniqueness is it's just the basic amino acids. So the ammonium group on the terminal end for lysine, arginine, and histidine, that interaction itself has a potential to be a very big role in protein nutrition, because we use lysine as a reference amino acid when we're formulating, and it's a second limiting amino acid. So any decrease in lysine efficiency utilization through the binary interaction could also decrease balance as well as digestibility overall. So a lot of potential effects, especially as we go to more digestible diets that are more precise, because we'll have lower amino acid excesses, and that means more digestible levels, and that means more crystalline lysine in the diet. So something we ought to look at.
So we are really on the edge between the anti-nutritional and undigestible parts. What do we mean, in fact, by this difference, and what are their consequences on feed digestibility? And I'm sure Knut Erik has some illustration on the digestibility due to that.
Well, if I should try to illustrate some of the effects that potentially can occur when you have fibers in the diet, I've tried to illustrate that with the difference between a flour and a bran fraction from oats. On the left side of the slide, you can see the microscopy works that was done on the feed, how it looks, the cell structure looks, and also how it looks when it has passed and collected from the ileal of the animals. And you can see that particular some part of the cells they pass more or less completely untouched during that part of the gastrointestinal tract. The consequences of that is that the digestibility of potential available nutrients as fat and also as protein, as you said, that is apparent digestible proteins, but in this case it wouldn't matter. They are substantially lower in the bran fraction as compared to the flour fraction. So that is one of the contributing factors of the fibers in the diet.
Thank you, Knut Erik. Maybe Jean can complement on that, and with the eye on swine and poultry.
Yes, I think as has been shown by Knut Erik, I think clearly when you have more fiber in the feed, the energy digestibility of the diet will be decreased. And that is very clearly illustrated on that slide here, which was obtained on a large number of diets, where you can see the more fiber, or the dietary fiber estimated here as the NDF, the more dietary fiber, the lower is the energy digestibility. So clearly, dietary fiber has a negative impact on energy value and energy digestibility. But I think what is interesting also on that slide is that when you give the same diet to adult pigs instead of young growing pigs, you have a marked difference in energy digestibility. So the digestibility is much higher in adult pigs. So that means that from the feed that is available, that is given to a growing pig, there is still some energy and some nutrients which are excreted by the young growing pig that can be valued and used by an older pig. So that's also illustrated similarly on that the other slide here that shows that the more dietary fiber you have in the feed, the higher will be the excreta, or the amount of energy or organic matter that is excreted. And again, in agreement with the previous slide, clearly this excreted energy or excreted organic matter can be reduced or attenuated only by the age of the pigs. So that means that feed has one value or is digested in a young animal, but there is some part of the feed that is not used or which is excreted, and that can be used under other circumstances, like here in heavier or older animals.
And so, looking at poultry now.
So poultry, yes, I think you have exactly the same. I have on that new slide here, I have taken a few examples of recent data where we compare, I would say, a control diet, which has a low fiber content, and a high fiber diet, or groups of high fiber diets. Clearly, the broiler behaves exactly as a pig, in a way that the more fiber you put in the feed, the lower will be the energy digestibility, or the higher will be the excretion of energy and organic matter. I think the same is illustrated on another set of data obtained on a large number of diets by Carré at INRA a few years ago, where you have a figure very close to what is obtained in pigs. The lower is the metabolizability, I mean the ME over gross energy ratio in the feed, according to the higher dietary fiber. So clearly, dietary fiber is a burden. It has a negative impact on energy utilization, digested utilization, and clearly that should be taken into account. So similarly to pigs, I have plotted the data of Carey showing the connection or the relationship between dietary fiber in the feed and the amount of excreta, or the amount of energy that is excreted. And you can see very clearly that the more dietary fiber in the feed, the higher will be the amount of energy. So the question now is, I think, is should we, as we have seen in adult pigs versus growing pigs, should we be able to modify and to increase the energy utilization and decrease the amount of excretion of energy by using other technologies such as enzymes? So that's one question that we'll try to answer maybe during the talk or also during the questions. So what we have done, for instance, in pigs, for taking into account that extra effect of body weight on energy value and energy digestibility, is that we have been able to propose correction factors of energy value of pig feeds according to the amount of organic matter that is not digested in the young pig. So you have a minimum value which is obtained in young animals, but you have plenty of room to improve that energy value and to reduce the energy losses by a lot of circumstances and technologies, and I think enzymes is one example that would fit exactly in that model for improving and correcting the energy content of pig feeds.
Thanks, Jean. So we just focused on energy, but what about protein and amino acids? And maybe, Mike, you can respond on that regarding the amino acid and the digestibility and the consequence on amino acid use.
Yeah, I put a flow chart together just to get our head wrapped around the amino acid digestibility, with everything coming in from the feed mill through purchasing, high quality ingredients, low price, but the optimization of digestibility has to be the end point. And I put a few graphs there to think about endogenous enzymes and work that's done in the gastrointestinal tract, coupled with exogenous enzymes, ultimately leading to reduced nitrogen excretion and a more efficient model that we follow in the bird today. And that sets up the next slide, which is the protein digestion. And in this protein digestion cartoon that's been drawn, there's two phases. One of which is the uniqueness of the bird that couples the low acid environment with HCl, with the gastric juices, in addition to the work from the gizzard and the muscular action that breaks down the protein and results in feed solubility and thus protein solubility, whereby the second phase would come into play, which is the enzymes, trypsin, chymotrypsin, elastases, coupling with carboxypeptidase A and B, rendering these proteins being broken down more and solubilized, and the hydrophobic nature of the compounds being exposed more, which then ultimately starts sending small peptides and amino acids down into the lumen and the small intestinal tract. And with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about some digestibility that could be affected in a stressful situation. And I say this because we want to look at what environmental factors are affecting amino acid supply. In this case, we're referring to potentially ABF type programs, coccidiosis vaccination programs, or a coccidiosis challenge, mild versus necrotic enteritis, things that occur that we are seeing more than we have in past. And how does this lead us to deal with amino acid nutrition? The amino acids that are listed in terms of the mucin layer, and that's so important because those amino acids are going down into the gastrointestinal tract and they enter the unstirred water layer. They're at the tip of the villus and they're ready for absorption based on optimal digestibility. But the gut is going to utilize what it needs to make things work, and threonine particularly, valine particularly, isoleucine as well being a branched chain, or three of the many that are listed there that have the propensity to have different requirements based on the gastrointestinal stress. we have shown that threonine, for example, anywhere from 5 to 10% of a flux of a minimum formulation could be done to adjust for dirty environments. So there's a lot to be said for how we're going to optimize amino acid digestibility in very stressful situations. The next slide is particular because it talks about a different stress. Dr. Scott Verdon, when he was working on his PhD, he looked at physiological stresses in a number of different ways. He induced the physiological stress through corticosterone, and you can see in the graph that's drawn on the left-hand side a tremendous drop in body weight and the stress of the bird. But looking at the amino acid digestibility, it's potentially unaffected. So I think we need to think about the stresses that are relevant to the gastrointestinal tract based on digestibility of amino acids going forward. The work that we're going to need to do is going to balance not just the NSPases and phytase, but all anti-nutritional factors on the compounds that exist for the undigestible portion of the gastrointestinal fluid that exists for digestibility. And I wanted to get a little practical. So this slide shows threonine use in the United States with regard to the history and how it came into play, and why use this for digestibility concept, because it wasn't until we accepted in the United States amino acid digestibility where threonine was optimized. It was easy with methionine and lysine. We got rid of the protein minimums, we got rid of lysine minimums, and things became more tricky. And the harder, it gets harder the further down the chain you go with looking at amino acid limitations. But clearly, for us to move forward in nutrition, we're going to need to focus on digestibility more and more and more. And lastly, with that said, this is a graph that Leandro Hackenhar and I put together, and we basically did least cost run times on the fourth limiting amino acid, and we're going to need to focus on those minimums because they're going to change depending upon the ingredient profile. We were just traveling in other parts of the world, and in many places it could be valine or it could be isoleucine, and we've even saw some tryptophan as the fourth limiting amino acid. So the digestibility is going to be the key for us to figure out how we're going to move to the next level with low protein diets and optimization of amino acids.
So thanks, Mike. So I think it's interesting. We started with the substrate, I would say, and the interconnection between the different undigestible parts or anti-nutritional factors. We enlarged to energy availability, then to amino acid availability. So now the solution could be, I would say, enzyme. But how to move from an individual enzyme action to a global effect, and to a global effect on the global digestibility of the feed. And maybe, Knut Erik, you can first address the complexity of the substrate, in fact.
Well, to use the enzymes, it's very, very important that you, or at least to use the enzyme in a proper way, it's very important that you also consider the composition of the substrate. And as I explained earlier, the fibers, they can have a very complex composition, and when you are in this slide, I've tried to illustrate some of the complexity, going first from the cell walls in the upper part on the right side on the slides, and down to a more fine structure of the polysaccharides present in the cell walls. And if you then even try to dig a bit further down to the cell walls, you'll see that, and use arabinoxylanes, which is the main hemicellulose part of cereals. You'll see that if you are going to degrade such a polysaccharide, you need actually a number of enzymes. And in this case here, it is a model of arabinoxylanes from wheat. And you can see that to break that down to its monomeric constituents, you need silonases as the activity. That is the main one, because it acts on the backbone of the arabinoxylanes. Then you also need arabinofurosidase. You need glucuronicidase, you need acetyl xylose esterase, and also ferulic acid esterase. So you need a number of different enzymes to be able to cleave it down to monomeric components, which also quite well illustrate that arabinosilane, that's only one part of the fibers, but there's many more. So it is indeed very, very complex substrate we are dealing with, and it varies from one feedstuff to another.
And even if we consider the different feedstuff, comparing, for instance, wheat, corn, or even rice, the complexity of the arabinosilane might even be more challenging for the enzyme.
Yeah, even you can even go as far as saying if you're looking on the arabinosilane within a grain, it's different whether it's in the endosperm, the aluminum cells, or the pericarbon tester. And even more variability you get when you go across the different cereals. So that's just to illustrate.
Okay, and just to illustrate that, in fact, we tried in a trial that we are presenting here an enzyme with a range of enzyme activities on a wheat-based diet, for instance, in that case, to start. When you look at the improvement of organic matter digestibility, it's always very often easy to demonstrate an increase in digestibility, but it's important to look at the different nutrient part of the feed. And we looked at the starch digestibility, the protein digestibility, the fat digestibility, and even the fibers. So we destroy the fibers, but we increase the individual digestibility of the different components. And globally, that increase the organic matter digestibility. To validate this concept of global feed digestibility, we took roughly the same type of diets that we diluted with sand, and we used 3% of sand in the diets that decrease the digestibility of the diet. And here on the left part of the slide, you can see the standard diet and the diluted diets. Looking at the energy availability or apparent metabolizable energy, you can see that you decrease by 3% the level of energy available for the metabolism. When you compensate with the enzyme with a large range of activities, you restore, in fact, the standard energy level of the diets. And if you look on the right part of the slide, you can see that also is valid with the amino acid digestibility, which shows that, in fact, the enzyme is not working on the energy per se, it's working on the global nutrients of the diet, the starch, the protein, the lipid, and so on, and increase the total feed digestibility. To go even further, maybe Mike, you can add some comments.
Well, you said it well. In the environment that we're going to be in the future, specifically poultry, I'll speak for that. We're going to have our phytase, and we're going to have our NSPases, and we need to look at the nutrient matrix and how we should be formulating to optimize availability of ingredients and digestibility concepts. Clearly, we have our ideal protein concept, and we may express this relative to the energy content of the diet. It seems that we get birds that are more responsive to amino acids and less to energy on a yearly basis, but nevertheless, that's one efficiency. But I ask the question, should we be looking at the undigested portion as well in terms of how much optimization can occur from the multiple effects from the enzymes?